The night this happened didn't feel unusual at first, and that's probably what made it stick with me so deeply afterward. Because it started like hundreds of other nights where exhaustion outweighed. Emotion and routine felt safer than thought. As I stood on a cracked sidewalk outside my office building waiting for an Uber, watching headlights slide past like slow-moving reflections of a day, I was eager to forget. Work had drained me in the quiet, invisible way it often does. Not with dramatic arguments or explosive stress, but with endless emails, meetings that went nowhere, and the constant pressure of pretending to be alert when all I wanted was silence. So when the Uber finally pulled up, a dark gray sedan with slightly fogged windows and a polite chime from the app, I felt a small sense of relief knowing I could soon stop performing and simply exist. The driver, Amir, greeted me with a tired but friendly smile, and without thinking much about it, I opened the front passenger door and sat down, buckling my seatbelt as naturally as I would in a friend's car, because when I'm alone, I've always preferred the front seat, where conversation feels human instead of transactional, and where you don't feel like luggage being delivered from one location to another. The ride unfolded calmly, filled with that low-stakes small talk that doesn't demand emotional energy, as we discussed traffic patterns, construction delays, and how the city seemed to change every few months without ever really improving. While streetlights flickered across the dashboard and the hum of tires on asphalt created a rhythm that slowed my thoughts. When we reached my apartment building, Amir pulled over near the curb, glanced at his phone, and ended the ride in the app, the familiar notification sound marking the official conclusion of the transaction. But neither of us immediately moved because the conversation hadn't actually stopped yet, and there was no urgency pushing me out the door. We talked briefly about parking enforcement in the area, about how drivers were constantly worried about tickets and how unpredictable passengers could be. And I remember thinking how rare it felt to have such a normal, respectful interaction with a stranger, especially in a world where everyone seemed permanently on edge. That sense of normalcy shattered the moment I noticed someone standing just outside the car, close enough that her shadow stretched across the hood under the streetlight, her posture stiff and confrontational, as if she had been watching us for some time and had finally decided it was her responsibility to intervene. She was a middle-aged woman, well-dressed, hair perfectly styled, clutching her purse like a shield, and her expression carried a mixture of suspicion and certainty, the kind that suggests a conclusion has already been reached before any facts are considered. And when she tapped sharply on the passenger side window, the sound felt louder than it should have in the quiet street. I lowered the window slightly, already sensing tension, and before I could even ask what was wrong, she demanded to know why I was still sitting in the front seat of an Uber. If the ride had already ended, her voice sharp enough to cut through the calm night air. I explained, calmly and honestly, that the ride had just ended, that I lived in the building, and that Amir and I were finishing a brief conversation, expecting that to be enough to satisfy her curiosity. But instead of backing off, her face tightened, and she shook her head as if I had confirmed something she had already decided. She told me that what I was doing was suspicious, that it wasn't normal to remain in the front seat after a ride ended, and that she didn't feel safe seeing something like this happen outside her building, even though she had no idea who I was, where I lived, or what the context of the situation actually was. Amir tried to reassure her, explaining politely that there was no issue and that everything was fine. But she cut him off mid-sentence, raising her voice and pointing her finger in his direction as if authority came from volume alone, announcing that she was calling the police because this situation looked wrong to her. At first, I genuinely thought she was bluffing, that she was using the threat of law enforcement as a way to assert control. But when she pulled out her phone and began dialing, loudly describing us as suspicious and implying that something illegal might be happening, the weight of the situation settled heavily in my chest. I stepped out of the car, not because I was required to, but because I didn't want Amir to face this alone, and I stood on the sidewalk a few feet away, listening as she exaggerated details, framed assumptions as facts, and painted a picture of danger where none existed, all while glancing back at us with an expression that suggested she believed she was performing a civic duty. Neighbors began to slow as they passed, some stopping to watch, others pretending not to notice, and I became painfully aware of how quickly public perception can shift when police involvement is introduced, how a normal scene can transform into something tense and loaded simply because someone decided to. Escalated. The wait for the police felt endless, filled with uncomfortable silence broken only by passing cars and the occasional muttered comment from the woman about how people these days don't understand boundaries, while Amir sat stiffly behind the wheel, clearly worried about how this might affect his rating, his job, or worse. When the police finally arrived, their lights flashing softly against the buildings, the officers approached with calm professionalism, immediately sensing that this was not the emergency they had been led to expect, and they began by asking what had happened. Before I could speak, the woman launched into her explanation again, emphasizing how unsafe she felt and how unusual it was for someone to remain in the front seat of an Uber after the ride ended, framing her discomfort as justification for involving law enforcement. When it was my turn to speak, I explained everything clearly and thoroughly, from ordering the Uber to ending the ride and remaining seated for a brief conversation, emphasizing that there is no law requiring a passenger to instantly exit a vehicle the moment a rideshare trip ends, and that nothing about the situation was illegal or threatening. Amir confirmed my account, showing the completed trip on his phone and explaining that everything had been normal until the woman intervened, and as the officers listened, their expressions made it clear that they understood exactly what kind of call this was. One of the officers gently but firmly explained to the woman that no crime had occurred. That feeling uncomfortable does not automatically mean someone else is doing something wrong, and that calling the police for situations like this can waste valuable resources. Her confidence evaporated in real time, replaced by defensiveness and embarrassment, as she tried to argue that she had every right to call if she felt unsafe. But the officer calmly reminded her that personal assumptions are not evidence of criminal behavior. After a brief warning about misusing emergency services, the officers told her she was free to go, then turned to us, apologizing for the inconvenience and assuring Amir that he had done nothing wrong. Before returning to their vehicle and driving away, the woman walked off quickly without looking back. Her earlier authority dissolved into quiet retreat, and the street slowly returned to its usual stillness, as if nothing had happened at all. Amir and I stood there for a moment, both of us shaking our heads, and he shared stories of similar encounters, moments when people projected their fears on ordinary situations. And I realized how common this kind of behavior had become. After tipping him generously and thanking him for his patience, I finally went inside my building, the adrenaline fading and leaving behind a heavy sense of reflection. Because what disturbed me most wasn't the inconvenience, but how easily someone had felt entitled to involve the police in a situation that required nothing more than minding one's own business. That night stayed with me, a reminder of how fragile normal interactions can be when viewed through the lens of suspicion, and how quickly everyday actions can be criminalized by assumption alone, all because I sat in the front seat of my own Uber for a few extra minutes after the ride had ended.